America faces a big choice on November the 5th.
And we who believe in reproductive freedom...
He says, you're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day one.
Perhaps the most important election in recent history is too close to call. But whatever happens on election day, and in the weeks that follow, the America that we thought we knew is gone, and it isn't coming back.
It's the enemy from within, all the scum that we have to deal with.
Join me, Dr. Emma Shortis, on After America as we discuss the final weeks of the campaign and how this election will change our world forever. After America is brought to you by the Australia Institute. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
There is no doubt that when the 60-40 vote came in against, not only did that narrow proposition of a voice to the Parliament, that was the only thing we really asked in the Constitution, that's what went down, but the broader politics of reconciliation was lost, so much so that we now have the opposition has no compunction in just burying the whole thing.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and the culture wars have been front and centre in Australian politics in recent months. Last year, the failure of the Voice referendum was a huge setback to reconciliation in Australia. Not only that, but some of the lies and misinformation that were put forward by the No campaign have had a lasting impact on our country. Then, last week, the devastating conflict in the Middle East was the latest issue to become a matter of political point scoring after a condolence motion on the anniversary of the October 7 Hamas attacks in Israel failed to achieve bipartisan support. To borrow the words of federal MP Tim Watts last week, there's plenty to disagree on, but the way we disagree matters. This week, I spoke with one of the country's leading political commentators in our Canberra studio for our fortnightly webinar series on federal politics unparliamentary. Paul Bongiorno is a 35-year member of the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery. He's a columnist for the Saturday Paper and the New Daily, and a regular 7am podcast contributor. We discussed how Israel's war on Gaza and now Lebanon is reverberating in Australia, reconciliation 1 year on from the Voice referendum, and the Prime Minister's flash new beach house. Here's Paul.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to start with kind of the heaviest and most serious topics before we get into local politics, which is the escalating crisis in the Middle East. Obviously, extremely concerning. Lots of deaths of civilians in both Lebanon now and obviously in Gaza in particular. A ceasefire really seems a long way off. And now it's beginning to impact, I think, in Australian politics. But where do you see this at the moment in the context of Australian politics, this conflict?
Well, there's no doubt that the conflict in the Middle East is causing great pain for a lot of people in Australia. I think the estimate is that 10% of Australians are very exercised because they have relatives either in Gaza or Palestine or in Israel. And so it's a very personal involvement that they have. But I think tensions are also raised by the fact that the daily horrors that we're seeing on our TV news has confronted people, especially the images of children of bombed out buildings and all of this thing continuing all the time, which I think affronts people's sensibilities in its own right. But I think another thing that's happened is the war in the Middle East has become part of the culture war between the left and the right of politics.
It was 1 year ago today that Hamas militants stormed across the Israeli border, triggering fresh conflict in the region and sending shockwaves around the world.
It's been a day of deep reflection. Members of Sydney's Jewish community came together at Bondi Beach at 6:29 this morning, marking the exact time the massacre began.
Rallies are taking place around the country protesting the ongoing Gaza war ahead of the 1-year anniversary of the start of hostilities there.
The death toll in Gaza continues to rise. Its health ministry says over 42,000 people have been killed.
Israel's bombardment and invasion has killed more than 2,000 Lebanese as the IDF tries to push Hezbollah back from its border and stop the rocket fire on its northern communities.
This is a divided parliament, as we said, on an issue where there really should be unity among the major parties.
And your predecessors would have had the decency to respect the Jewish community in a way that you have not done today. And for that, Prime Minister, you should stand condemned.
There are many things that we can disagree about in this conflict, but the way we disagree matters. We've got to disagree in a way that recognises that we have more in common as fellow Australian citizens than what divides us.
We could have found a way through this, and I am once again disappointed by this House and the politicisation of this issue, because the country is looking for us to come together.
This came to a big head last week in the federal parliament on the anniversary of the October 7 Hamas attacks, when the federal opposition refused point blank to support a motion that the Prime Minister put up that expressed sympathy not only for the Israelis who lost their lives and who were taken hostage and who were badly injured, but also extended the sympathy to the 40,000 plus. I mean, these days that's considered a minimal view of the death toll in Gaza alone. But also, as we saw last week, extending into Lebanon, now hitting, several thousand, if not more. And of course, overhanging it all is the prospect of Iran, coming back into the fray. So Peter Dutton has been uncompromising in his support of Israel. He rarely, if ever, expresses any sympathy for the Palestinians or any condemnation of what even the international court, as far says there's more than prima facie evidence that Israel is breaking international law. Never pays any attention to that, but attacks the Albanese government, and did this in the parliamentary debate last week for speaking out of both sides of its mouth, by wanting to have sympathy for the victims on the Palestinian side as well as the Israeli side, and for calling for a ceasefire. In fact, on the weekend, we saw James Paterson, the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, when he was tackled about the fact that the opposition was not agreeing with the government on a call for a ceasefire, but that the Biden administration still called for a ceasefire, even though it understood why Israel was going into Lebanon to try and clean up the Hezbollah. Patterson made the, quite amazing or novel, really, admission that the opposition, having previously criticised the Labor government for being out of touch with our major allies.
The Prime Minister should be clear where he disagrees with the US. Are you clear that you disagree with the US on a ceasefire at the moment?
Well, David, it wouldn't be remarkable for an Australian politician to disagree with an American politician, particularly the United States administration under President Biden and Vice President Harris is a centre-left administration. I'm from a centre-right political party. There will be times that we disagree, and mature adults can be open and honest about that. This is unremarkable.
This is our main ally.
Which undercut the whole argument that Dutton's been making, that the Albanese government's stance is out of tune with our major partners and allies. It's now emerged beyond reasonable doubt, Your Worship, that it's the Dutton opposition that's out of tune with the United States and our major allies in Britain and in Europe on the response to the war, that people realise that the hostilities cannot go on. I read in Haaretz, which is an independent journal of some note in Jerusalem, which says that there is criticism in Israel of the Netanyahu government's determination of an unending war to absolutely root out Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, all of these proxies of Iran, no matter where they are and no matter what the cost. Interestingly, in Haaretz yesterday, there was an opinion piece by Gideon Levy that said that this cannot go on without bloodshed and heartache, not only for the Palestinians and the Arabs, but also for Israelis themselves. And we're seeing already that the Israeli population is itself terrified. And just today, the Australian government has warned in its travel advice that no one should go to Israel and Australians in Israel should come home.
I mean, the death toll of civilians has been just awful. And as you said, primarily in Gaza. But we hear again and again, obviously, this idea that Israel is doing its best to avoid civilian casualties, but its best really isn't very good. There's tens of thousands of people have now been killed. And the other escalation that really concerned me was the explosion of those devices that I'm not sure that they've taken responsibility for. But regardless of who did it, that seemed to be, again, a bit like drones, like another kind of a thing that really has that impact to indiscriminately kill civilians in a way that we haven't seen before. And I think marked another new and alarming kind of chapter in that conflict. But I guess, how is the government responding at the moment to this, and how are the Australian people responding to how the government is handling it? Because as you said, there's a lot of people who have loved ones or family or friends in all of these countries, and Peter Dutton is obviously very much playing the domestic politics of this with that really hardline stance to only back Israel.
Well, there are some indications that his stand is misfiring. For example, the Essential poll last week found 56% of Australians, now this coincided with the debate in the Parliament, 56% of Australians are satisfied with the Albanese's government's response to the Israel-Gaza war. And there was a separate poll in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age which found that 51% of Australians don't want the government to take sides in the conflict. And interestingly, they don't see this conflict as the sort of threat to Australia that we should get involved in militarily. For example, 67% surveyed by Resolve don't want any form of military involvement, either sending military equipment, 67% were against that, or sending military support, soldiers, 72% were against that. Now, some might say and point to the news poll this week. So it's the first news poll Labor has lost since 2020, and it undercuts Albanese's statement in September that he's the only government for some time that's never lost a news poll. It's a bit like Malcolm Turnbull and the 30 news polls that Tony Abbott lost. You should be careful about some of the claims you're making. But the news poll by a smidgen, 51 to 49, rounding out, put the coalition ahead for the first time. The primary votes for both hadn't changed, but there was a shift in the minor parties, which led to the way the preferences were allocated. Yeah. Now, Kevin Bonham, an analyst, says that it's a bit overblown what this actually means, because basically since the failure of the voice referendum, Labor's been sliding and the opposition Labor have been, pretty well neck and neck for months. But Bonham did some, maybe to calm the nerves of some of those who think that Dutton's about to win the election. Not only did Bonham say, well, not the first government, to be behind during a term in news poll only to go on and win an election.
Yeah.
But also people made a lot of the fact that Albanese now for the first time is as equally unpopular or disapproved, if you want to be a bit technical, as Peter Dutton. He minus 14, net minus. So in other words, more people don't like him than like him, or approve than do. And same with Dutton, minus 14. Now, Bonham did some homework and he's come up with 3 prime ministers who had worse approvals who went on to win the election. Hawke, we forget this, Hawke had a net rating of -25 and he won an election. Keating -44 and he famously won that election.
To overcome.
And Howard on 2 occasions, right? He was -31. So it was a long way down the tube from where Albanese is at the moment, -31, and then Howard -36 on another occasion. So, look, one government insider said to me, look, one of the problems governments have is governments get blamed for everything,
Yeah.
And in a sense, that's right, because if anything goes right, they claim credit for it. So when things are going bad, they've got to wear it. So the test now is going to be does Albanese have what it takes, given that he's not as far behind as some of his predecessors were, to go on to win like Hawke, Keating and Howard did? And some in the Labor Party are a bit worried that maybe he doesn't. They think that he hasn't got the touch that he needs, whereas others think that these are just nervous Nellies. And one said, look, don't take too much notice, quote, of the bedwetters. So I think that there's a bit of perspective there. And whether it's the response to the war in Gaza or not is, I think, not really relevant. I think all the polls point to, and the other polls this week on housing affordability, basically it's the cost of living struggles, it's the housing crisis, it's the rental crisis. All of these things, I think, are playing much more relevantly into how the parties are travelling. And in fact, it was put to me, which I wrote in the Saturday paper on the weekend, it was put to me that Peter Dutton's in grave danger, if he hasn't already done it, of making this, or creating the same perception that Albanese did with The Voice, that he was concentrating on something that a majority of the Australian electorate didn't think was their top of mind issue or worry.
So there it is. Anthony Green has called it at 7:24 p.m. The Indigenous Voice referendum has been defeated.
Australia has voted no to enshrining an Indigenous voice in the Constitution after this long-running campaign.
This moment of disagreement does not define us, and it will not divide us.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Throughout the referendum, Peter Dutton said he would hold a second referendum. And again, misleading commentary like that really created far more confusion than it needed.
And speaking of, the Voice last year, it's the 1-year anniversary since the Voice referendum, and we've seen some reflections on the lack of success of that campaign, and particularly how the yes and no campaigns were executed. A year on, what impact has this had on the project of reconciliation, would you say?
Well, it's been a disaster for reconciliation, and it's taken a toll of Albanese and the government. So there's two big losses there. So let's talk about reconciliation. There is no doubt that, when the 60-40 vote came in against, that not only did that narrow proposition of a voice to the parliament, that was the only thing we really asked in the Constitution, that's what went down. But the broader politics of reconciliation was lost, so much so that we now have the opposition has no compunction in just burying the whole thing, not talking about another recognition referendum or anything like that. As they
dumped
promised.
That pretty quickly.
That's all dumped. We don't need any of that. And you have Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, the Nationals, the spokesperson on Indigenous Affairs, saying, well, the government's dropped everything and it doesn't want to do anything, which is actually not correct. And I noticed that Melandiri McCarthy, the new Minister for Indigenous Affairs, pointed out this week that she has on several occasions tried to have meetings with Price so that they could discuss ways forward in closing the gap. And of course, Melandiri McCarthy, the new minister, points out that the Albanese government is still pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into Aboriginal programs in an attempt to, close the gap. And also at the state level, there are programs and moves underfoot on truth-telling, perhaps even leading to some sort of state-based treaties. But at the national level, it does seem that that loss has badly spooked the way in which Prime Minister Albanese, wants to deal with the issue of reconciliation. If he hasn't buried it, which I don't believe he has, he certainly believes that the Australian electorate has sent him a message and they want him to get on with other things.
it's really kind of clawed back, I guess, ambition overall. But I guess in contrast to Peter Dutton's warnings about division, I feel like it really has played up those divisions in the community as well. And certainly First Nations communities, a lot of the reflections that I've been reading themselves are obviously feeling very rejected, and there's no real path forward in terms of a lot of those issues that were facing that community that they wanted the voice to help them solve, things like the health gap, the education gap, those kinds of things. Tell me a little bit more about what you were talking about with Malarndirri McCarthy and the things that she's been talking about.
Well, the things that she's been talking about is that there are programs out there, that they do have bodies set up, that they do consult with. They are looking for voices. All these things are happening, but if you like, they're not being trumpeted. And I think that that's unfortunate because it does show, as I was saying, a tentativeness that which is a direct result of the failure of the referendum on, well, if you listen to the opposition and Jacinta Price, maybe Warren Mundine, but more Jacinta Price, we're all equal, so why should anyone get special treatment?
Yeah.
So just on that, I believe the way forward now has got to be that Australians, from the moment they start school, right, have got to be taught the truth in the broad, the good and the bad and the ugly, and the beautiful of Australian colonial and pre-colonial history. Because a lot of Australians don't understand that the real point of the referendum was to redress an historic injustice, that there were people here that we dispossessed, that if you want to put it in plainer language, that there were people here who were robbed of their land, taken over without recompense, without recognition. And it was so bad that these people weren't even considered to have been human, let alone have any claims. Terra nullius, no human being with any legal claim existed on the country. Well, all of this is a grave historic injustice that will not go away. And I suspect and hope that as the decades go forward and people are given a broader understanding of our Australian history, that they will want to redress that and see that there are Australians who have a special claim to our founding document and who are owed reconciliation and, in the broad, recompense.
Yeah. And I think that history still, we've got such a long way to go on that. For example, it was only recently I found out that where I grew up in Nowra and Bomaderry was kind of one of the sites where they sent the Stolen Generation. One of those notorious homes was in Bomaderry, and kind of a place that I had driven past on numerous occasions, just not knowing anything about that history of it. So it's all around us, and there's still a lot for people to learn about.
Just on that too, I think one of the big lessons has got to be surely, and the 7am podcast has been doing in many ways, a gut-wrenching series this week on Alice Springs that goes down what we've got to learn from our failures, the Stolen Generation and also the Northern Territory intervention, that paternalism is worse. It doesn't work. As if you can solve problems of domestic violence by sending the army in, for example, or by merely taking children out of dysfunctional relationships and families without trying to address the cause of the dysfunction, without trying to make sure that it doesn't keep on happening. I think that we were thinking or beginning to think in those terms. We can't let the failure of the voice referendum stymie or bury a more sensible and a more humane and a more respectful approach.
Yeah. And indeed, as you say, like the evidence shows that where Aboriginal communities are involved and can help design some of those programs that are designed to reduce the gap, they have had great success. Yes. For example, if people can remember during the pandemic, Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations had some of the best results on earth, basically, for managing the pandemic for a long time. And they were doing that on the smell of an oily rag.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of success stories to build on. I want to move now to the ACT and Queensland elections. Here in the ACT, we've got, I think some people have referred to it as a forever government, with Andrew Barr as Chief Minister for a long time now. Do you see any prospect of that changing in the ACT?
Well, it's very interesting. Have you seen any opinion polls on it?
No, I haven't either. I was just thinking that.
No, I haven't. Okay, so the Liberals, by their corflutes, have twigged to the idea that 23 years is a long time. So they're obviously hoping to work on the its time factor. One thing about the ACT, however, it is an involved electorate. And I think that the Liberals have gone a long way with Elizabeth Lee as their new leader to come up and position the party in a way that would attract more support from the Canberra electorate. We see, for example, at the federal level, David Pocock, an independent, displaced Zed Seselja, and the more conservative Liberals that had taken over and still control, as far as I can work out, the Canberra Liberals. However, they've realised that they need to position themselves differently, and in Elizabeth Lee, they have an articulate proponent of what you might call centre politics. I noticed that the Labor Party is so worried about it that they're even saying, oh, well, Elizabeth Lee might be okay, but look what the people behind her did when they voted against assisted dying, when they've got a hardline attitude on abortion, et cetera, hoping to say to the electorate in broad, from Labor's point of view, don't be fooled, Elizabeth Lee is still the leader of the old Liberal Party.
Yeah.
And she's gone a long way to say, well, she's leading a refurbished Liberal Party. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. There are independents running here, taking their leaf out of the Pocock book. Craig Emerson, the former federal Labor minister, his son is running as an independent. It'll be interesting to see how they go. The Greens did very well last time, forcing Labor into an alliance with them to govern. It'll be interesting to see if they can build on that. So maybe we end up with the Greens majority government, I did notice, by the way, that Elizabeth Lee didn't rule out governing with anybody, although she did say the anybody would have to be, in sympathy with where the Liberal Party wants to go. So, look, I think the balls are in the air, as they say. Kate Carnell and then Gary Humphries were the last Liberals to be Chief Minister, and they were definitely moderate Liberals.
Yeah.
And the party they led at the time, the Canberra Liberals, were definitely a moderate Liberal Party.
Yeah.
So,
well, perhaps Elizabeth Lee is the start of moving back towards being moderate, but perhaps not quite there yet.
No, well, we'll see. Yeah.
But I think you're right about, it was very clear at the last couple of elections, I thought, that the Canberra Liberals had drifted very far away from where the Canberra community is. So at least, they've recognised that with the leadership. But in Queensland, it looks like Labor is headed to lose at this election after being in government for a long time. But Labor Premier Stephen Miles is throwing absolutely everything at this campaign. He's released a lot of what I would think very simple and popular policies that will probably resonate with a lot of people, like free school lunches would be one example. But a lot of things that are very practical, like taking over vacant hotels and apartment buildings and turning them into crisis and social housing and those kinds of things. But do you think it's going to be enough to shift the dial by the time they get to the election?
Oh, well, if you can believe the opinion polls and the ones over the last few years, actually, it's a very hard ask, and it'll be a boil over if he holds on. There's no doubt about that. Something in common, interestingly, between the embattled Queensland Premier and what Elizabeth Lee, the Liberal leader, is doing down here. They seem to be promising, popular policies like down here in Canberra, it's lower rates and all sorts of wonderful things, all sorts of new amenities and all the rest of it. And down here, the Chief Minister says, well, how are you going to pay for it? We'll find out later. Up in Queensland, you have a different sort of pitch to the argument. The main way in which the Miles Labor government is paying for anything is the fact that it upped mining royalties. And so, if you like, it's using the natural wealth of the state to bankroll what the citizens of the state need. And I think that's a very hard argument for the LNP up there to go against. Although I do notice that I think it's the school luncheon initiative. I think it was pointed out by the opposition up there that they're going into debt to pay that. But you'd have to say, looking at the windfall that they get from mining royalties, that it would be definitely a manageable debt.
Yeah.
But look, I do think that the indications are that the electorate has moved beyond that sort of thing and probably have taken the fact that Chris Afuli has gone out of his way not to scare the horses, and he's even matched some of Labor's more popular promises, like, for example, 50 cent a bus. Public transport.
Yep.
And all. And even on the issue of abortion that flared last week, Chris Afuli has tried to dampen that down as well, although there's nothing he could do about, say, a Qatar party bringing up a private members bill on abortion and then demanding and getting, I presume, conscience votes. And I think there's a big difference now. For example, in the 80s, Premier Bjelke Petersen got his deputy, Liberal leader Bill Knox, to move or to bring forward into the parliament a stiffening of the criminalisation of abortion in Queensland. And it was a revolt in the National Party room then. There was the Nationals and the Liberals. It was a revolt in the National Party room then that forced it to be a private members bill, not a government bill, and forced it to be a conscience vote. And a significant number of the Nats and the Libs and Labor voted against that bill.
Yeah.
The indications are now, if an abortion bill came before the Queensland Parliament, that it's a very different LNP beast. The Christian right has got enormous influence in there. And as we saw when the abortion laws came up, when was it, last year, I think only 3 LNP people voted according to their conscience, and one of them was forced to quit.
Forced out.
Yeah. So maybe that's a real issue there. Maybe it isn't, But, I think as a debate, it has some sort of a real relevance, especially for the women of Queensland.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in Queensland, it wasn't that long ago that they were prosecuting women for, they charged a young couple with trying to procure an abortion. That wasn't that long ago.
Precisely.
I do want to now move, I guess, to the news from today that Anthony Albanese has purchased a $4.3 million oceanfront home. Very lovely for him and his partner, Jodie, who apparently is from the coast. So that's why they're purchasing it. But how do you think this is going to land politically, Paul?
Okay, well, look, there's no doubt the headline does look to be tin-eared in terms of a government facing a housing crisis, a rental crisis, an affordability crisis. People, there was even the Redbridge poll earlier in the week that showed there's enormous pessimism with 75% of people, especially in regional and rural Australia, pessimistic that their children would ever be able to buy a house without help. So it's into that sort of political context that this news breaks. Now, Albanese today at a news conference pointed out that, yes, they've signed the contracts. It is on the Central Coast, but he's waiting on the sale of his house in Dulwich Hill before he can go ahead with it, and he will declare it. His focus isn't on buying this $4.3 million house, which, by the way, his real estate agent said he's got a bargain because the sellers had it on the market for 4.6 and couldn't move it. Other people have pointed out what you get for $4.3 million on the Central Coast is a whole lot different to what you would get down in Sydney. And I saw one comment earlier that Tony Abbott and Peter Credlin, when Abbott was still in Malcolm Turnbull's on backbench, they used to deride Malcolm Turnbull for his Point Piper mansion, Mr. Harbourside Mansion.
I remember
Someone
that.
pointed out that would be worth probably around $40 million. It was
10
interesting.
times.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. Peter Dutton was asked about the Albanese purchase, and he actually congratulated Albo and Jodie because they're getting married next year. And as you say, the reason for it was that that she's a third-generation Central Coaster and they'd like to live up there. So Dutton congratulated them and he said, look, but my more concern isn't about the Prime Minister and his fiancée, it's more about the people who can't afford to get into housing. And I think that Peter Dutton wisely didn't throw any more stones because only a couple of years ago he sold a Gold Coast property he owned for $6 million.
Yeah, and I think he's probably got many, many more properties on top of that, is my understanding as well. So, perhaps he knows he doesn't have a leg to stand on there. But as you mentioned a couple of times, cost of living really still is driving voter sentiment and the issues that they care about. And yeah, I think that one's got a long way to go. I think in your Saturday paper piece, you kind of, I think you mentioned the fact that, you know, people obviously really care about this issue. It's one that really motivates a lot of voters, and that the Prime Minister had told his party room that they're going to go to the next election with some kind of big, bold ideas. So perhaps some additional measures on housing might be part of that. When are we expecting these big ideas to kind of start to be vented? Only when the campaign starts proper, or soon?
Every other day we're hearing about cost of living relief, like the supermarkets last week. Then we've got the today there's a talk of when you wear your debit card, that they'll outlaw the charges, you know, the hidden charges for using the debit card. All of these things are happening along the way. There is, I think the government's holding its breath and fingers crossed on both hands that the Reserve Bank will finally start to lower interest rates, which will go a long way to maybe shift perceptions on if the crisis is finally being addressed. Of course, it's a dreadful issue politically because, as John Howard once remarked, he's never met anybody who complained to him as Prime Minister that the value of their house was going up. And a hell of a lot of people own houses, you know. And one of the solutions to the housing crisis is for the value of houses to come down, you know. The other
or even just stop growing as quickly as that'd be a start.
Yeah, and the other issue, of course, is housing supply. And look, the other thing that the strategists in the Labor Party are saying is that, look, as we get closer to the election, when push comes to shove, people say, well, look, we're not all that happy, we're a bit pessimistic, but what are the other side going to do to solve the problem and how, you know, quickly? And we got a bit of an example today. Michael Sukkar, the opposition housing spokesman, was on Radio National. And in his interview, when Patricia Karvelas put that on him, he really had nothing to offer except that closer to the time you'll hear more from us. Certainly what they've put out there so far is all on the demand side, not on the supply side. And as we know, when you help give people more money to buy houses, it tends to put the price of houses up.
Just pushes the price up.
It doesn't build any. You know?
It certainly doesn't.
And it'll be interesting to see, just as Albanese surprised everybody with the stage 3 rejig, said, oh, political suicide, which it turned out not to be, maybe they will revisit negative gearing and, more to the point, the capital gains tax discount, because the concessions as they stand do nothing to build new housing. It does a lot for investors to buy existing housing.
Yeah, it makes it much, much easier for someone to buy their second or third property than for someone to buy their first one as a first home buyer.
Yeah.
And I do think it shares some properties with the stage 3 tax cuts in when you look at them combined. The benefits of that are an effective cost to the budget of many, many billions of dollars each year, and primarily going to the people who need it least, to the people in, you know, the top 10, 20% of income earners.
Well, when you say all of that, probably in government, if you say, yes, we're going to do this, but we will grandfather it. So everybody that's got what they've got won't be taken away.
Or you can all have at least one investment property, but, you know, maybe we'll restrict it after that, you know, those kinds of things.
Or that the concessions will be on new builds rather than old builds.
Yeah, there's lots of ways that you could slice that would make it certainly fairer for a lot more people. That's where we'll leave this episode of Follow the Money. Thanks to Paul Bongiorno for joining us. This discussion was recorded on Tuesday the 15th of October, and things may have changed since recording. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today, and you can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute. That's with an AUS. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.